Baroness Meacher, a crossbench peer who chairs Parliament's all-party group on drugs law reform, said this.
Most of us, many of us anyway, have the occasional glass of wine or beer. We drink coffee, and many people smoke. All these things are legal and yet far more dangerous than, for example, a drug like cannabis, which I certainly wouldn't recommend just like that. And the illegal form of cannabis with very high THC levels is, of course, high risk for people with any kind of family history of psychosis. But it's very interesting that GW Pharma are now developing a medicine based on cannabis for schizophrenia, no less.
Among the listeners getting in touch afterwards, Peter Kay.
Not that Peter Kay.
Our listener, Peter Kay, was a psychiatric nurse for more than 20 years. He was concerned about the suggestion cannabis could be used to treat schizophrenia.
My experience has been with people with schizophrenia and related illnesses that we generally call psychoses. Many people have discovered to their cost that smoking cannabis will certainly make their illness worse. Very ironically, I'd actually spent the day running a training course talking about things like the effects of cannabis on people's mental health. So I'm driving away back to my B&B and along comes Baroness Meacher saying the things that she did, which left me very shocked, to the extent that I had to stop my car as I was driving along and contact the BBC to express my concerns.
OK, Peter, we hear you. Sir Robin Murray is a professor of psychiatric research at King's College London and specialises in the links between cannabis and psychosis. He's been looking at the medical evidence behind Baroness Meacher's comments.
In the 90s, we began seeing a lot of young people who had really been getting on very well till their late teens and early 20s. And repeatedly the families would say, do you think it could have anything to do with cannabis? And we would say, no, cannabis is a safe drug. But we saw this so frequently, we started doing research into it. Now, there's no doubt heavy cannabis use increases your risk of psychotic illnesses like schizophrenia.
Why?
In cannabis, the critical substance is called THC or tetrahydrocannabinol. We've given this to normal volunteers. A proportion of them will develop a transient psychosis. They'll become suspicious. They'll think we are out to harm them. So there's no doubt you can produce a psychotic picture with just one shot of THC. There's now lots of studies following up people in their teens who are smoking cannabis or not smoking cannabis 10, 15, 20 years, and the people who have been using cannabis more likely to go psychotic.
And it's the THC that causes that?
It is, yes.
What about CBD?
Cannabis has a number of different constituents, but the big ones are THC, which is why people take it for the euphoriant effect. CBD seems to be, in some ways, the opposite. When we give THC to people, if we'd pre-treated them with CBD, they don't go psychotic. It seems to block the effect. If you really batter at the cannabis, 5 joints a day for 15 years, it can damage your hippocampus, the area in the brain which deals with memory. We all have in our brains cannabinoid receptors, and THC stimulates these. CBD seems to somehow block the effect of THC on these.
Should cannabis have a sort of 50-50 mix of THC and CBD? Is that the best thing?
Well, nobody knows quite, but what we do know is that in old-fashioned hash or resin, soap bar sometimes, from Morocco, there was about 4% of THC and 4% of CBD. In the 1980s, an American who's called Sam the Skunk Man left the USA because of the Reagan war on drugs, went to Amsterdam, and there he paired up with the tulip growers and he bred high-potency cannabis or skunk. And this contains between 16-18% of THC and hardly any of the CBD, the good guy. It's been sort of eliminated.
Is it your belief then that the Nancy Reagan war on drugs helped contribute to the stronger cannabis?
Well, that's how Holland became the centre for high-potency cannabis. Government policies sometimes have odd, unexpected effects.
Where does that leave us then? If CBD has a sort of positive effect, a calming effect, if you like, on THC, is there a safe way, or a safer way, I should say, of consuming cannabis on a regular basis that wouldn't cause a psychosis?
We don't know that. I would say it's a bit like alcoholism. You can become an alcoholic drinking vodka or drinking shandy, but it's a lot easier on the vodka or the whiskey. And it's the same with cannabis and psychosis. You can become psychotic through using the low potency stuff, but you have to try very hard.
And I suppose when most people are buying cannabis, they've got very little idea of what they're getting.
No, I don't think that's true. Skunk, Sinsemilla types, they have taken over the market. For example, Rastafarians who've been using low-potency cannabis all their lives, they're complaining they can't get a hold of that they only have skunk, which many dislike.
What do you think the danger is of this increasing potency?
The evidence is that if you take the high-potency stuff with a lot of THC without the countervailing CBD, then you're more at risk. Now, it's not that everybody who smokes cannabis is going to go psychotic, but certainly if you're smoking a skunk every day for 3, 4, 5 years, you're putting yourself at risk, particularly if you start in adolescence when the brain is still developing.
Is it safer if you start later?
There's some evidence of that. There's some animal experiments, for example, giving a THC to juvenile rats, and that has a much bigger adverse effect than giving it to mature rats. We certainly see mostly the people who've started when they're 12, 13, 14. They run into trouble in their late teens and early 20s.
You're familiar with the political and social arguments there are over decriminalisation of cannabis. There are changes in some American states and there's pressure for more change in others. What's your opinion of where the science takes us in terms of harm?
Well, you can't decide about cannabis just on the basis of what doctors say. You've got to take into account people's enjoyment, you've got to take into account road traffic accidents and so on. Curiously, cannabis consumption has been declining in Britain over the last 12, 13 years by quite a whopping amount, by 20% in young people. So the situation isn't as bad as some people paint. Essentially, I think we should wait and see what happens in the US. I say that doing studies on rats or monkeys is very expensive. You have to look after them, keep them in cages. Now, Americans are doing it for free. So we just wait and see what happens in Colorado. If there's more psychosis or more road traffic accidents, we should be cautious.
Lab rats, human lab rats.
American lab rats for free.
Can cannabis be used to treat schizophrenia?
We don't know that yet. There's been one published study by a German chap called Lewicki, and he compared a standard antipsychotic with CBD and showed that they were equally effective. Now, GW Pharmaceuticals, who are a British pharmaceutical company, have some preliminary data that suggests that in people with schizophrenia who are not responding fully to their antipsychotic, adding some CBD may be helpful. So it's early days, but it is possible. You can't get CBD in the UK. I mean, there's no market for it on the street because it doesn't produce a high.
And what about the arguments about harm, comparing cannabis to tobacco, alcohol, caffeine?
Well, I mean, there's no doubt that smoking is very much more dangerous in the long term. Far more people die of cigarette smoking than any of the rest. You can't directly kill yourself with cannabis. You can develop psychosis and then commit suicide or terrible things happen. Lots of people say, well, alcohol is more harmful than cannabis. But of course, a large proportion of the male population's drinking 8 pints or 10 pints of beer a day. If they were taking 10 joints of skunk a day, we would have a lot more paranoia.
And the idea that cannabis never killed anyone, what do you say?
Well, I could introduce you to a lot of very sad mothers who had a smart young son who was, sociable, got into the cannabis in early teens, went psychotic. They may have died by doing something foolish under the influence or else committed suicide. And there's also a big question about what it does to your intellectual faculties. This is more contentious. If you talk to people in their 20s or 30s, many will say that there was a really bright chap in their class at school who got on the cannabis, and now when they meet him, he seems to have lost his faculties. He's a stonehead.
And then you meet other people who say, I use pot fairly regularly, I've held down important work, I've got a loving family and it's fine for me.
Of course, exactly. I have a colleague who's a professor who has been taking cannabis of the old-fashioned type for several decades, and you couldn't meet a smarter person. What we do know is that vulnerability to these substances varies in terms of your genetics. Some families, alcohol seems to be a problem through the grandfather, the father and the son, perhaps because they have some way they metabolize the alcohol. And there's quite good evidence that several different genes predispose you to have a bad reaction to cannabis.
We've talked so far only about men. What about work on women and their response to cannabis?
Most of the people we see tend to be young men. Not to do with their susceptibility, it's just that they take more drugs. Both drug abuse and psychosis tend to be commoner in men. Ultimately, I think just as we're going to be able to test people genetically in order to see whether they should have a prescription medicine, it sounds like 1984, but we would be able to test people and say you're vulnerable to taking cannabis, you're vulnerable to alcohol, or else the opposite, that you don't seem to have the vulnerability genes.
So Robin Murray, Professor of Psychiatric Research at King's College London. You can hear a longer interview with Professor Sir Robin on our podcast, and we'll have more about our podcast in just a moment. For details of organisations which offer advice and support on addiction, go online to bbc.co.uk/action line or call the BBC Action Line to hear recorded information on 08000 155 947. Lines are open 24 hours and calls are free from landlines and mobiles.